Chia Network Incorporated is working with a newly formed entity called Permuto Capital. And essentially, what is happening here is there is a new way that stocks are going to be able to be traded on the Chia blockchain. So, Lucas, I know we've been following this very closely. There have been a number of hints and rumors about what's been going on. This morning, there was a press release that was dropped where all of this was announced. And yeah, let's dig into this a little bit further.
Well, I woke up to I woke up this morning to see that Gene was in a space with Aceville. I saw you on the stage, and I began running to catch up at that point. So Gene has been hinting at this strongly, telling us that this was coming, but I'd like you to catch me up with what I missed at the start of that space, because I came in at a point whenever Gene and a man named Thomas, I'm not sure who he represents or where he entered in the picture. We're answering questions about this trust, and about using about how do we put this? Using the side door of voting.
Yeah, let me catch you up on what I know
Okay.
so far. Yeah, I've had a chance to be around a few of these things, and I was there. So what's going on here is there's a new entity that's been formed, and this new entity is similar to the ownership structure that has been set up with Berkeley Compute. So Chia owns 50% of this company, is presumably working very closely with Permuto Capital. So that's the partner. You know, we had been hearing about a partner. It's this is the partner. And Permuto Capital, you can read more about this, and there'll be stuff in the show notes. So Permuto.capital, and that's what we're looking at. They have created a trust. And this trust is detailed out in the S1 that's listed here. So on their page, you can see that they've got this S1 listed. And if you dig through that in a bit of detail, what's going on here is they've formed a trust, and it looks like the trust is specifically tied to Microsoft. And when we were talking about this in the space this morning, the individual who was mostly speaking was a guy named Trent Martinson, and he is the co-CEO of Permuto Capital. I'm not familiar with co-CEO as a title, but like he's one of the top guys there. And they had come from Gene's interactions with Credit Suisse. So I think he may have first run across these guys when Chia was originally working on going public through Credit Suisse, and then that blew up in their face and didn't exactly work how they had intended because of a black swan event. And so they got to know each other, and they started thinking about how something like this could work, and that's the birth of Permuto Capital. And so what's going to happen here is Microsoft shares are going to be placed into this trust, and the trust custodian is US Bank. So there's a major bank that is involved in what's going on here. And apparently the legal firm that was associated with helping all of this get done was these guys, Skadden, I believe, Skadden Arps. So the trust has been created, then the shares will be deposited into the trust, and as a result of the depositing of the shares into the trust, they will then enable trading of Microsoft shares on the Chia blockchain using one market. But additionally, there's something interesting that's happened here, which is the dividends associated with the Microsoft shares are split off. So you can independently invest in the growth of Microsoft if you want to hold the appreciation stock part of it, or if you just want to have the dividend rights, you can invest in that. So one of the mechanisms that Gene was talking about was, he said, as this starts to happen, and there are certain requirements for who can deposit shares into the trust. And so you have to be an accredited investor, and there's a certain amount of shares you have to have. But if you have the shares that you've bought on the open market out there in the normal stock exchanges on the New York Stock Exchange or whatever, and then you bring your shares over to the custodian, then they will issue the asset tokens on Chia and enable these things to be split and sold and whatever. And there's some fees associated with this, and there's some plans around how all this is going to work. But yeah, that's the basis of it, is that there is a law that Gene read that enables all of this to happen. And so they very carefully read the law, what enabled them to do it. And so today was the announcement that these things were in place, and that this was all going to start happening. And so if you read through the S1, it's interesting because there's a couple things in here that it specifically calls out that caught my eye, at least. So it says the trust is not an investment company registered under the Investment Company Act of 1940, and the trust is not a commodity pool for the purposes of the Commodity Exchange Act of 1936. So they're calling out two things that the trust is not. I wish I'd had a little bit more time to dig through this S1 to figure out exactly what the regulation that Gene read, that he very carefully looked at, that enabled them to do this particular thing and enable this to work on the Chia blockchain. But hopefully we'll get some more information about that. But in a nutshell, yeah, that's what's going on here. Is there's a mechanism whereby shares can be put into this trust, and then once they've been put into the trust, there will be tokens on the Chia blockchain that represent the company as a whole, as an investment piece, and then the dividend piece particularly. So you can selectively invest in the thing that is more interest to you. So people that are more interested in fixed income, whatever, they may be buying the dividend portion of the rights, and then people that want to participate in the growth of the company, they might be able to buy the stock. And so by splitting these two things off, it enables for some more sophistication and more interesting ways that stocks can be traded. Specifically, what Trent called out is this is not appropriate for all companies. He said that companies which have very high valuations, we're talking north of $100 billion, and that have a long history of dividends, those are the primary targets. So Microsoft, probably Apple, stuff like this that have a long history of paying out dividends are going to be the first targets for creating these. And it looks like to me, at a first read of the way that the S1 is structured, that they'll need to do an S1 for each of the different stock types. I don't think that the trust is such that they can put any shares they want in there. And Trent did mention that there was a somewhat significant costs in setting this all up. So I think that relates to the legal paperwork associated with creating the trust and creating the mechanisms whereby the stock can be deposited. So I think they've got to rinse and repeat n number of times to create these things, and then that enables the market. So this is the underlying legal infrastructure that enables all of this stuff to function and work.
Grant, I'm having some epiphanies as you're going through this. So what this is stating right here is that the trust does not fall under the regulation of the SEC nor the CFTC. And we've talked a lot in the past about the difference between money and financial instruments, and how what crypto had brought to the world and what the world was grappling with was this notion that there is a difference between money and financial instruments. And it seems that this is what Gene has figured out how to express. And from the, how do I phrase this? From the privilege of contract, or the right of contract that is enshrined in the Constitution, and that the federal government cannot interfere in the states, the Constitution denies the states from interfering with contract. And you think about what that is: agreements or trust between two people exist in our minds, and we may memorialize them on paper and pass that around, but that trust is a sacred thing. And so I think that you told me Gene referenced a 17 1792 Act, and that must be the Coinage Act of 1792.
Yeah,
And I,
he had specifically, because he had mentioned that he had read some law, and they had used the word black letter law, which was not a familiar term to me. And so there was also a point at which Thomas Chow, who is the legal counsel for Chia Network, said they did a very careful read of this. Gene was looking at it, and he said, "You're either crazy or you're crazy like a fox." And I specifically had a chance to ask him, like, what was the law you read? And they wouldn't say. And the one time that I had a chance to ask him about it, and then today they referenced the number 1792. So it could be that it's the Coinage Act. I don't think we have 100% clarity on what it's at yet, but yeah, this was the only thing that we could dig up as far as pinned to 1972. And he also said that it was something from before 1950, and apparently it was also referenced that ChatGPT wouldn't have knowledge of this. So if you go throw this into some of the AI, the AI hasn't been trained on the particular thing that they use to pin this. So there is some legal infrastructure. Well, we're speculating that it might be this one, but this will be another development that we'll have to try to suss out in the coming days as this starts to get more information about what's going on here.
well, I think at the very least we can say that the point that that they're turning to older laws is because agreements are sacred between people, and it's interesting to me that one, this is put in the terms of trust, but also in the voting rights of shareholders. And so I think there's another aspect in severing the what's being recorded as being a security, or the security agreement, and as the shares for with regards to the voting rights that are ascribed to the shares. So it's possibly through that window that that Gene has found approval from the regulatory bodies, but we'll be hearing more from him in the future. So
Yeah, so kind of coming back to what's in the announcement. So this announcement came out this morning. There's the dividend certificate and the appreciation certificate. And there was mention of a bridge from the DTCC to the Chia blockchain. So apparently the DTCC is involved in some way as well, because the depository trust clearinghouse, we have covered this in the past, that they have been working on some sorts of stock things in the past with different chains and whatever, and apparently they are involved with what's going on here, because they specifically said that there was a bridge, and it seems like the trust itself is the bridge. So there is a mechanism whereby if you hold one of these appreciation certificates and a dividend certificate, that you could go to the trust and redeem that and then get a share back in the normal sense. So there is a way to sort of interact and loop this whole thing. And there are also some ways where you could say, I don't want everything to be split off. And so there's some nuance to exactly how you interact with the trust, the ways that you would be able to move things back and forth. And there's some quirks in this. In the Chia ecosystem, these certificates are going to be traded as Chia asset tokens, or CATs, as we commonly refer to them. And there is a visibility limit in the size of a CAT. So a CAT is limited to 3 decimal places. So if you think about something like Berk A, if you were to bring Berkshire Hathaway into this infrastructure, that is a 6-digit, valuated stock. And so the smallest division of that you'd be able to have would be 0.001. And it means that you don't have infinite divisibility for these stocks, and that there may be a minimum amount that things are valued at. And this was something that came up in the Chia ecosystem the last time around, when a very high value asset was bridged across, namely BTC, because BTC is trading at 5-6 digits, and that means that the smallest divisible amount of BTC that was wrapped or traded on the Chia blockchain was something like $100 or $200, and that's just gone up. So if you think about that minimum divisibility, there is a limit to the amount of divisibility. You're not just going to be able to trade like 1 penny of Microsoft shares. It might be that the smallest amount that you can trade of Microsoft would be like $4 or something like that. So it'll be interesting to see how the nuance of this works, as well as some of these traditional things that happen when stocks split or reverse split, and how all of that's going to work. Like if a stock split happens or a reverse split happens, what effect does that have on your asset token, and does it immediately affect in the price? And there'll be some interesting nuance to how all this works, but it's very exciting. The last time I remembered seeing anything even close to this was in the Terra Luna ecosystem, where there was this mechanism where you could speculate on the price of stocks. They didn't actually have stock ownership. It was just a way to speculate on price. This is actually a mechanism where the underlying rights to the stock in the trust are carried by the appreciation certificate and the dividend. And that means that it's possible and likely in the future that your dividend would actually be distributed to you on the Chia blockchain using mechanisms like secure the bag. This was something that Gene specifically talked about. And all of this apparently is motivated by reducing costs, by enabling more fluid markets, and to create one market where stocks can trade 24/7. So if you think about, after you've put these stocks into the trust and you have these assets on the Chia blockchain, there is no Microsoft can only trade during certain hours of the day. Now Microsoft can trade all times of the day. And because there's already an options mechanism on Chia, which has been used to give a future price on Chia, now you can have a fully featured options market on Chia. So this idea of one market really seems to be coming to fruition with the announcement from Permuto.
Grant, did they address the relationship with Microsoft at all?
Yeah, I specifically asked that. I said, does Microsoft know what you're doing? And Gene had a pretty interesting answer. He said, they will soon. So it sounds like they didn't know, and they didn't have to ask for permission. I think the way to think about what's happening with Permuto and the trust is that this is like an ETF. When you make an ETF, an exchange traded fund, you go out and you select a bunch of the stocks that you want to be in the ETF. And then that ETF trades according to the underlying assets that are in the ETF. You don't have to go ask. You can just say, hey, I'm going to create a basket. I'm going to grab some Apple. I'm going to grab some NVIDIA. I'm going to grab some Microsoft. And all of these things are going to come together and they're going to trade as a whole. And all of those things are under the control of the ETF. So it seems like it's similar to that. They didn't have to go ask for permission. They went and just got the shares of Microsoft the same way anybody would go buy shares of Microsoft, and then they put them into the trust. And because of this trust infrastructure and mechanism, that's what allows them to be traded as a real world asset inside of the Chia blockchain.
What about GameStop Overstock stock registration? Could we see this in light of creating a blockchain stock registration entity? Is that what this trust is doing?
I asked that exact question because you know that we've been talking about this kind of stuff. We've been talking about the DTCC. We've been talking about computer share direct registration. So I asked that very specific question. So how does this relate to the direct registration of shares? And Gene said this lends itself towards that. And he said that there is something about what's computer share is doing and how it might be enabled by what's happening here with the infrastructure put in place by Permuto and Chia, but that he didn't make a strong announcement about it. So I expect to hear something further about what computer share might be doing with this infrastructure, or how they might be restructuring to enable how they've traditionally done their direct registration and direct ownership of shares on the Chia blockchain. So it might be that they start to switch over. So I imagine that they were one of the entities that Chia went to talk to as this thing got ready to launch, because direct registration of shares seems very natural as you start to do this. And they did talk about voting rights and governance. And so a lot of what has happened with GameStop and naked short selling and overstock could very well be impacted by what's happening here. As stocks are represented on a blockchain, it's pretty hard to envision how you would naked short something like that. So as we start to have more things that are put into the trust and you can count up the number of shares and you have strong accounting, I think the world starts to change. And he did allude to some of that, but I didn't get a super strong answer. But he said that it could have affected it, but I didn't get a clean answer out of Gene when I asked the question about overstock.
Well, and he also, what I did catch also when I was in the room, he said this would only, that they were only going to be entertaining very large companies because of these liquidity issues. But I assume that also means that what we are going to see with Microsoft and with other trusts that are created through Permuto and Chia and 3V Securities, is that not all of the stock certificates are going to be registered in the trust. Is that correct?
It seems that the way this is going to work is they're going to have to make a specific trust for each stock. That's the way it seems to me, and the way that when Trent was talking about it, that there was a significant cost in that there were only certain entities that made sense to do it this way. And I think it's related to the mechanisms of having a dividend certificate and an appreciation certificate. I mean, you can't really envision having a dividend certificate for a stock that doesn't pay dividends. And he said that this doesn't make sense to do it for a company that's valued at 1 billion or 10 billion. It's got to be 100 billion or more. So there seems to be a criteria under which these types of trusts would make sense. Your company is worth something north of 100 billion. You have a track record of issuing dividends, and that's the likely candidates for doing this kind of stuff. Now, I'm sure they have plans for in the future how to make this more efficient and get all stocks trading. I imagine as they've started to think about this, they there's the smoky room where everybody gets super excited and envision a future where that happens. But I think in the immediate now, the types of stocks that we would expect to see traded in this way would be things like Microsoft, Apple. These are big, high value companies. They're in the hundreds of billions or trillions in valuation, long track record of paying dividends. These are the ones that we can expect to see start trading on the Chia blockchain.
And Gene also spoke of a new CAT standard that they had published that had to do with the CATs that are associated with these certificates. What was this new CAT standard, and what was important about it?
They're using the same old CAT standard. So these are just Chia asset tokens. So they're using CAT 2. So there's
maybe it was a chip that they had published. Do you remember?
Yeah, he did say something about a chip, but I think that has to do with the tail. It's how the asset issuance works, because there was a question, do you have to always be paired? Like, do you always have to have an equal amount of the dividend and the appreciation pieces, and do they have to interact in a particular way to ensure that they're paired? And Gene specifically answered that question and said, there are instances where you would not want them paired and that you might want to split them apart or have an imbalance. So it's definitely the case where when you deposit shares in, that you can have control over how this gets split up. And the people who can interact and deposit and also withdraw, they have some criteria. You have to be an accredited investor, and there are certain amounts of shares, and there's fees associated with the interactions there as well. But once the tokens are issued on the Chia blockchain, those fees don't occur. So the fees happen at the bridging, when you're either, I guess, for the sense of using our more common bridging terminology, wrapping or unwrapping of these assets. There is a place where you're interacting, and that actually occurs. And so once you've deposited the shares into the trust, or you're withdrawing the shares from the trust, that's when these CATs either get minted or melted. And so there are rules around which the minting or melting of these cats can occur, and that's the, I think, standard or the chip that went through. And it was one of the things that Gene mentioned. He said, we've been building this wide out in the open. We have been putting all these pieces in place to enable this to occur. And these little things have been worked on for over a year. So all these little different pieces, whether it's the cloud wallet or the chip you're referencing, they're all the enabling pieces that were required to come together to make this happen.
What else struck you in the conversation?
The excitement. I mean, really, it seemed like both of the people that are working with CNI on this from Cavu Securities. That's where if you were to look them up, that's their previous life. Now they're working at Permuto. I don't know if they're splitting their time or if they're fully on to Permuto. But it was Trent Marsdenson and Chris McMillan, these two guys from Cavu Securities who have been in the spaces and are also announcing it. Just how excited they are. It seems like they really feel like they've cracked a very particular piece of the puzzle, that they have worked diligently with their legal firm and with the SEC to ensure that this is all done correctly and in a legal way, so that this is going to be legally binding and that it's been enabled. And they did say that there were specific things about the Chia blockchain that make it really compelling to do it here, but that they expected that there may be other blockchains or entities that try to copy what's going on here. Just as there are lots of people who create ETFs, that there may be other people who look at exactly what happened here and say, I could do that on a different blockchain. But Chia thinks that they've got some special characteristics of how the Chia blockchain works that enables them to do it better and cheaper. And they kept beating that drum very particularly, that this was something that made everything cheaper, that made things flow better. And they also reference things like there are ways that some of this stuff existingly works, and there's a 20% fee. Well, Chia envisions that the fee should be cut from 20% to 10%. So it had a lot to do with efficiencies and lowering fees and making things work better. That was something that I heard them repeatedly say, is that the Chia blockchain lets you do it better. And Trent specifically said that the blockchain felt like the ultimate back end.
And when they talked about a blockchain being the ultimate back end, did they talk about did they address the speed of blockchain transactions, of Chia transactions, and front running? Did they talk about that at all?
That one didn't specifically come up. I didn't hear them say anything about the speed of the blockchain was something that was a benefit or not a benefit, but rather that the fact that it traded 24/7 was kind of a more important impact. The blockchain doesn't stop. The Chia asset tokens are always available to trade. And that means that these assets and these markets can react at times when the stock market is not normally open. And that is a big change. Like, I don't think we've had 24/7 stock trading in the past.
I don't either. No more bank holidays. Did they talk at all about different price thresholds for different settlement times? Is that going to be? It,
No,
I assume.
I think they said everything just pretty much settles the way it settles on Chia, which is you have immediate finality, as soon as you've traded something. And this all works with offers, as we've been talking about in the past. Offer files, they will just work. So if you want to do a peer-to-peer trade of Microsoft, you're going to be able to do that, and you'll be able to do it with an offer file, because these stock certificates, the appreciation stock and the dividend stock, they represent your underlying right to claim in the trust. Like, if you wanted to go claim inside the trust, you just have to have a paired up set of certificates and be an accredited investor, and you could go withdraw from the trust. That was discussed and mentioned. So there are ways to interact with it. And the other thing that was brought up was some of the access to markets in the US have been pretty limited. Like, if you wanted to buy a US stock, you kind of had to be a US person in some way, or you had to get access to it through a broker that was working with the US stock markets in some fashion. But once things are represented on the Chia blockchain, somebody from India that gets, some amount of assets in the Chia blockchain could go buy some Microsoft shares and then have exposure to Microsoft dividends. And that's pretty enabling and game changing too, is that now the whole world can start to participate in the US stock market.
Leading into this announcement, we had talked a lot about the depository trust company, and whether or not Chia was trying to replace the service that they provide with the registration of all of these stock certificates. But it seems that in making this trust, in this ETF, paradigm of what they're aiming for, that it's not in direct competition with DTCC. Did Gene or did Trent speak to relationships with other gears in the existing financial world?
It sounds like this in some way works directly with the DTCC. The words that I took a note on this when it was said that it was bridging from the DTCC to the Chia blockchain. So it sounds like the DTCC is involved in some fashion, and that the mechanism that the DTCC has been providing for stocks and for stock liquidity, that is still in place. Like, I don't think that they've cut that entity out. What their plans are for the future, maybe, as they start to do more interesting things, they might start asking, what is the DTC really doing for us? Like, what is the value that they're adding to the equation? But at this point, it looks like they're working with the DTCC.
And what of stock exchanges, the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ? Did they speak to any relationships with any exchanges or expectations of taking some of the services that stock exchanges provide?
I think the use of the word bridge is pretty important here. They're giving a term that we in the crypto world are used to. When we were talking about what does a bridge do, it's a way to trap an asset and then make it so that you can represent that asset someplace else. That trapping is an important aspect of what's happening here. I think that when the shares are in the trust, they're trapped there. They no longer trade on the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ or whatever. Like, they're not trading there anymore. They're trapped in the trust, and that's what enables the assets to be issued on the Chia blockchain. If they weren't trapped, I mean, think about what that would mean. That would mean that these asset tokens would be disconnected from the underlying asset. So I don't think that they come into play, because what happens here is the stock gets trapped in the trust, and then the asset tokens are created, and that is the general mechanism whereby you facilitate trading stocks 24/7. When you withdraw the shares from the trust, that's when they would trade normally on your gated community. You got to be a broker and all that kind of stuff over in the traditional world of stock trade. So I think the use of the word bridge is pretty important here, especially for people that are familiar with bridges, what bridges are in the world of crypto, and what it means to trap an asset inside the bridge so that you can represent something inside of a blockchain. That is a really important aspect of what's happening here, and that's what is detailed out in the S1, particularly of what this trust is doing. It's the place where the stocks are trapped, and that custodian being U.S. Bank. I don't even think we had a chance to mention that, right? It's U.S. Bank is the custodian that's going to be enabling this. So U.S. Bank is somehow going to be the custodian for the stocks that are trapped in this particular way. They are the entity of record that is working with the trust.
Yeah, that's. I'm glad you brought up U.S. Bank, because I was going to ask if Gene spoke about that relationship at all either. Did he speak of it at all?
Just that they were the custodian. he didn't go into exhaustive detail about, what history Chia may have had with US Bank or when they may have started working with them, but apparently they were selected. They're the ones that, Permuto Capital is working with. And I think that's the other thing that we have to remember here is that it's Permuto Capital that's doing this, just as Berkeley Compute is doing some interesting stuff with, with respect to GPUs and AI and whatever, and they're doing tokenized real world assets on Chia. It's via that entity. And I think what's going on here, the way that I read this, is that Permuto Capital is the one that has, enabled these trusts and is doing this kind of thing, collecting these fees, and that Chia has an ownership stake in it. So Chia is starting to look like an investor of record on a bunch of companies, right? At least Berkeley Compute and Permuto Capital, they have got a 50% stake in each of these. And so they have the rights to the profits of 50% of both of these companies. So I would imagine that we might hear that, there was some investment from CNI into Permuto Capital, just as there was an investment from CNI into Berkeley Compute. So it seems like this is the new way that Chia is starting to grow its revenues and do interesting things. It's somewhat manufacturing customers in a sense, right? I mean, Permuto Capital is a customer of Chia because Chia did all this infrastructure work to make this happen. Without the Chia blockchain, without all these things that Chia did to enable this to work, they wouldn't have been able to do this. And they did specifically reference the place for the cloud wallet, because I know you've been asking about that. You said, why would I want a cloud wallet? Why would I want anything like this? And apparently, the rationale for why you'd want a cloud wallet is right here on this button in Permuto Capital. So apparently, there's going to be some way to log in, and you'll be able to see your interactions with the bridge, right? I mean, if you think about what Permuto Capital is, it's a way for an accredited investor to bring their shares in. So if you go out to your normal broker, if you're on TD Ameritrade or Fidelity, and you go buy some shares, and then you come to Permuto, if they have a trust set up, then you can deposit your shares of Microsoft, and then you can get your Chia asset tokens, and now you're self-custodying your stock. Whereas in the traditional infrastructure, there's no way to do that. You can't self-custody your stock. Like, you can directly register it, but it's always via a direct registration partner like Computershare. But Computershare is holding the stock. So now, I guess what you can do with Permuto Capital is you can interact with Permuto Capital somewhat similar to the way that you would interact with Computershare. Is you can go to Permuto Capital, create an account, then send your shares into Permuto Capital. They tokenize them for you, and then they say, okay, well, where do you want your Chia asset token sent to? You give them an XCH address, and boom, they show up in your Sage wallet. And now you can go to Dexy and start trading them or whatever. And then at some point, if a dividend has been paid out, it sounds like they will be doing distributions on the Chia blockchain. So there's probably a configuration setting that you'll be able to go into Permuto Capital and say, yes, I want distributions of my dividends to be paid on the Chia blockchain. And using the sophisticated infrastructure of Chia, such as Secure the Bag, they'll be able to pay out the dividends to all of the shareholders that have the dividend certificates. And one thing that Gene brought up specifically was, when you have stock this way, it makes tax accounting easier and better, because there's an easy way to know what was the price of the stock when you acquired it, what was the price of the stock when you sold it, because they're pinned to the blockchain. There's an immutable ledger of when you acquired it, when you sold it, and it's really easy to go look those things up and say, well, what was the price of the share? And so tax accounting becomes easier, and the distribution of dividends becomes easier. And there's a built-in options market because of what Cameron Cooper created with his options contracts on Chia. So it looks really interesting and looks really fun. And I can definitely hear the excitement from the Chia crew and also from Permuto Capital, as this is a brand new thing that's never existed in the world before. And it sure seems like if there wasn't all of this Chia infrastructure, that it would be really hard to have pulled this stuff off. And you can see right where the cloud web wallet comes in, because now Permuto Capital as a customer of Chia can say, yep, we want one of those web wallets. We want all that infrastructure behind that so that the customers of Permuto Capital can interact with the bridging mechanisms and the Chia infrastructure, so that you can go take custody of your Chia asset tokens that you ask Permuto Capital to tokenize for you.
You know, I was struggling a little bit. I was sluggish in seeing everything come together. But it's interesting that you do bring up that cloud wallet. That didn't seem to make a lot of sense. It sure makes a lot more sense whenever you paint it from that light. So we'll keep our eye on what's going on here. We're in at 40 minutes. I don't know if you have anything else you want to add, but thanks for attending the space and bringing me up to speed on what she is up to.
I think we're due to have Gene come back on and talk to us directly. I was glad that I had a chance to be in a particular couple of places where I got a chance to ask some questions, and I'm excited to see how this plays out. Honestly, it's a very exciting time to be a part of the Chia ecosystem. Can't wait to see Microsoft shares start trading on DEXI. That'll be a pretty cool thing to see. And when the first dividend is distributed on the Chia blockchain using Secure the Bag, this is the kind of stuff that people in the Bitcoin community have been talking about for a long time. It's now manifested on the Chia blockchain. That's exciting to see. I'm excited. I'm super stoked to see all of this stuff come together and all the plans that Chia has been putting in place and the little tidbits they've been dropping come into fruition and enabling stock trading 24/7. This is an immediate settlement. I mean, as we talked about before, we have had T2, T1, T0. It trades at the speed of the blockchain now. This is how things should work. Honestly, it looks like we're living in the future right here. Permuto Capital has ushered us into the next world of stock trading and immediate settlement of stock.
Well, let's get Gene in here. We'll give him a chance to get some sleep, and we'll reach out and see if we can get him on to answer some questions, tell us more about this. But absolutely, we're living in the future, and it's exciting. So thanks, Grant. We'll see you tomorrow.
All right, we'll see you.